I'm sitting with pastor, author, church planter Scott Sauls, who's also husband to Patty, father to Ellie and Abby, and welcome to the Gathering Podcast.
Thanks, Steve.
We're so glad you're here. And you're doing the Bible studies, the morning devotionals that happens every morning in which we're here.
Yeah, the morning teaching. Yeah, which has been fun so far for my one experience.
Well, I think we may want you for a lot longer than just this weekend. This has been fantastic.
Well, thanks.
Thanks for that. Now, you mentioned it today that right now you're at Christ Presbyterian Church in Nashville, Tennessee.
Right.
But prior to that, you were at Redeemer.
Correct.
And with another gathering favorite, Tim Keller. Maybe two questions. What did you get from him? Because I think when you're on a pastoral staff, there's stuff that you're going to get from different people in the atmosphere.
Sure.
And what did you feel like, how would he answer that? What did you give to him?
Well, I started out running the small groups ministry and then rotated in as one of the preaching pastors and then became part of the succession plan and then became not part of the succession plan, which is a long story that actually has turned out to be a beautiful story for all of us. But long and the short of it is we ended up in Nashville about 5 years after starting in New York. But what I gave to Tim really was somebody to mentor. I think I was one of a handful of people who had the privilege of getting to spend a good bit of time with him and sort of, trailing him. And this was after 15 years of senior pastor and church planting experience myself, but there was still so much to learn from such a key global leader. And, to your question, what I went in to the Redeemer experience thinking was, hey, I'm going to get to learn from, be mentored by, live up close to one of the greatest evangelical thought leaders of our time, arguably the greatest evangelical English-speaking preacher of our time in many people's opinions, and left, and those two things are still on the list. I still believe those things about Tim for sure, but left with greater impressions of other things that had more to do with the way he conducted his private life. He's a man of deep prayer. The more well-known he became, the more famous he became, the more humble he became, and you don't see that very often. Usually it goes in the opposite direction. He was an avid learner, reads about 80 books a year at least, and goes through the whole Bible every year, prays through the book of the Psalms every month for I don't know how many decades now. His marriage is very solid. He and Kathy are a great team. They work in tandem. And just sort of a shy person. He's very shy about himself and very boastful about Jesus, and never heard him say an unkind word to or about anyone in the 5 short years I was able to serve alongside him. And so I think what I want to really emulate in the back 9 of my ministry years is really more the private character virtue stuff that got to observe. And Timmy's not a perfect person, but
Sure.
He's by all means putting a lot of energy into finishing well and prioritizing faithfulness and gospel virtue and his own spiritual formation, which is what I think makes him such a great preacher and leader.
Well, Christ Press in Nashville is certainly a church of distinction. A lot of people talking about it, the impact of your own ministry. How do you protect those very character qualities that you said you saw in Tim? How do you protect those in yourself?
So that's probably a better question for my wife to answer than me.
She is here, but
she is
not
here.
Here.
Reading a book back in our hotel room right now.
Good.
But golly, you have to fight for it, and I fight for it in a number of very standard, basic ways. I maintain daily interaction with Scripture and prayer. I spend about the first hour and a half of every day that way, and I don't sleep very well, and so I'm up before the rest of the world, and so I get afforded that time. And my wife and I have a very I would say rich marriage, and we engage one another on gospel virtue stuff, she has no hesitation at all. Speaking into my life when maybe if I get the big head or if I say something that sounds insensitive or whatever, she has permission, and I trust her to, speak into my life. And then I've got a handful of friends, guy friends that I connect with.
Are they all in Nashville?
They're all in Nashville. Every one of them is older than me, which I really greatly benefit from. All of them are about between 8 to 10 years my senior, and there's 7 guys in particular that I get with twice a month, and then we go out of town together, get us and our wives together on a pretty regular basis. But these guys are all sort of top-level leaders who have great, impeccable character, and so they're the kind of people that I hope will rub off. And we have a staff too, where feedback goes not only down the org chart but up the org chart. Anybody on our staff has freedom to come in and speak into my life, words of encouragement, challenge me on whatever. And we have an environment where we've just tried to cultivate that. I think that honors the gospel. I think Christ would have us as leaders, want to lead in trying to cultivate our own humility and gospel virtue. And so, and some days are better than others. I'm a pretty driven person. I'm a 3 on the Enneagram, which means like my unhealthy self is like super driven, and workaholic and all of that. And so you just try to put measures around yourself that keeps you healthy. And the healthy 3 can get some really beautiful things done for the kingdom and also enjoy life a little bit. So
well, you appear to mask that pretty well in light of the fact that whenever I'm talking with someone, if they've read your book or they're talking about you, they talk about a very calm, placid exterior demeanor, strong knowledge of the scriptures, but appears that all of life seems to be going on a very, very even keel. But you speak about a time in which depression was actually a fairly common topic for you. What was going on, and how did you break through?
I think I had just allowed myself to lose my way a little bit in ministry, and I think that's where my 3. If anybody, forgive me if your listeners aren't familiar with the Enneagram. It's just it's a different form of a personality test, but I'm the driven type. I'm the achiever type, right? And it was a season where I didn't feel like I was achieving, and had I think through the restlessness of that, discovered that I wasn't in a very healthy place, and there were idolatry issues in my life, and that's not at all to say that everybody who experiences anxiety and depression, it's because of an idol or some underlying sin. There are physiological reasons, their family of origin, brokenness, and everything. Always assume a compassionate posture with somebody who's going through that. But for me in particular, it really was circumstantial. I just sort of lost my way and was praying less and working more and all those things, and just sort of got trapped. But it was a period of about 3 to 4 months, and I think it's actually turned out, as all things do, in God's economy. It turned out to be a really important season of my life. It was very grounding. It sort of forced me to take a few steps back and just ask, why am I doing this anyway? Is this for my own name and advancement and glory, or am I in this for the glory of Christ and the love of my neighbor? Because if it's not that, then
did you have some guys around? Were these same 7 guys kind of?
No. This was before. This was before Nashville. This was during the New York years, and so no, and that's part of it too. I was maybe a bit more relationally isolated. I mean, I had a lot of people around me. It's that situation that I think a lot of sort of high-profile public people get into, where you have a lot of maybe fans and followers and admirers, but you don't have any friends. And I had a few friends, but nothing. I wasn't prepared relationally or socially to go through that kind of season, and it really ended up being my wife and my brother, who God used to really carry me through that season. Like, I couldn't even engage with my own kids. I could barely pray. There was only one verse in the Bible that made any sense to me, and so I
What
just...
verse was that?
It's in the Psalms. I think it's maybe Psalm 77, somewhere in the 70s, where the psalmist refers back to the Exodus event, and says, it essentially says that we see your footprints, but we don't see you, and I wasn't really feeling like I was seeing God, and yet there was this sense that He's walking me forward. Parting some kind of sea, and it took me back to the Exodus event with Israel, and just to think about how restless that must have been, running away from
scary place
the
also
oppressor.
when you're a senior leader of a congregation. That's got to be just terrifying.
Yeah, it was horrible. I felt like every preaching event was an out-of-body experience. I didn't even feel like I was even there. But it's really interesting. People come to you after a sermon or whatever that you don't even know what you just talked about, because you're just trying to hold it together, and they say, "Wow, that was really meaningful to me. Thank you." I'm like, I'm glad it was meaningful to one of us, But I don't know. I think those darker months have they've given me, I think, a new set of eyes to have more compassion toward those who suffer and who are going through dark times. Thoreau talked about how the mass of men lead quiet lives of desperation. Mm-hmm. So many of us are carrying so much, mm-hmm. and nobody knows about it. And kind of our success-driven culture tends to support that isolation, and right. Sort of there's this implicit pressure to isolate and not show weakness, and yet. And I don't know how it works in the business world or athletics or the arts or whatever, but in my line of work, in my calling, it seems that the more transparent you are about your own struggles, the more God does marvelous things around you, in the lives of other people. And so I think suffering is a common human experience. And
I was about to say, it's everybody has at least at some point dealt with some element of this. Mm-hmm. Maybe not to a deep, dark hole. We were just talking with Justin and Patrick a little earlier, and hearing about Justin's yes. journey and that kind of that dark crevasse that you're peering into. Yeah. Maybe not all of us can, to that extent, be peering, but all of us have moments in which that's a reality. And hearing your story helps my story. Mm-hmm. It's constructive and healing for me as well. You call yourself an accidental author, mm-hmm. and yet you're on your third book. This is some kind of accident. So why do you call yourself that? So
I just released my third, and I'm writing my fourth.
Okay.
I've got 2 chapters to go in the fourth.
Thank you for the difference in math.
It has become, it's strangely become part of what I do, and a lot of factors into that. But the accidental author, that comes from essentially a book agent that started to pursue me after I was at Christ Pres in Nashville for about a year. And I think he marked it on his calendar to call me every January. Hey, what do you think about writing a book? What do you think about writing a book? And every time I just thought, there's nothing that Tim Keller hasn't written or is not going to write that I could write better. And so just focus on what he's doing over here, and I'll promote whatever he does, because I can't write better than a better work on any subject than Tim can. And 90% of who I am as a minister I attribute to Tim. And so go to him instead of me. And then over time in our community, when I got there, it was a revitalization effort. It was a larger flagship church that had experienced some struggle and some decline, and the congregation had gotten older, and they were looking to sort of for a renewal effort where younger generations would be sort of recaptured, into the life and mission of the church, and that meant bringing new vision, new culture, new everything to that community. And we saw very rapid, results and outcomes, and now it's this beautiful intergenerational community. Thanks be to God, but a lot of the preaching that I guess supported the formation of a more diverse community. It's also more politically diverse. It used to lean really hard in one direction, and now it's a very diverse politically congregation. it's a diverse, becoming more and more diverse socioeconomically, even ethnically, and in a traditionally more Caucasian part of town, and yet we're experiencing a lot of beautiful, life-giving engagement around racial reconciliation and justice and so on. And what supported, I think, that sort of development of a more diverse community was I just kept feeling compelled to preach the gospel of reconciliation about how, God has removed dividing walls between heaven and earth through Jesus, between a holy God and a sinful and broken humanity. And an outworking of that is that he's broken down dividing walls between Jew and Gentile, and which represents class division, that represents religious and political, socio-political division. It represents Jew versus Gentile, represents virtually every division we could think of. And that was Paul's sort of running mantra in his writing and in his preaching. And I just kept coming back to that message of millennials, you need to learn from the traditional morality of your elders, and boomers, you need to learn from the justice impulse, the social justice impulse of the millennial generation. Like, it's not either or. You got to bring. Jesus would bring both and together. Personal ethics does matter, younger generation, and getting involved with the poor does matter, older generations, and trickle down only goes so far, and you need the millennials to remind you of the ceiling, much like Micah has been reminding us this week through his amazing art, prophetic art. But and so those sorts of conversations just sort of bubbled up, and it turned into a book. I don't know if Tim's going to write. As soon as Tim writes a third way book, my books will probably go out of circulation.
Well, I did want to talk about your book, because I think, one, you can tell the proof of a great book by how much yellow marker you've painted it with, and your book has plenty of that. What I was surprised is I actually thought this was going to be a book about just being friends.
Are you talking about befriend?
I'm talking about befriend, making friends, etc. But this book started quickly taking a whole different course. Let me maybe read some portion of it, and maybe have you comment on it, if that's all right. And there have many who have obviously stated that Jesus followers are in a fairly precarious position because of just a shadowing kind of cultural change that's going on. I think that's how someone related it to me. Yet you still talk about this embracing of people within the culture. This is what you said in your book. And I quote, "The more we walk the narrow path, the wider our communal embrace will be. The more convinced we are of the exclusive claims of Christ, that he is the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one comes to the Father except through him, the more inclusively kind and compassionate we will be." Tease that out for us a little bit.
So I think the subtitle tells the story of the book better than the title: Create Belonging in an Age of Judgment, Isolation, and Fear. And so the book was really written to address the climate that we're in right now culturally. But to that particular question, I think the account of the rich ruler has been really informative along the lines of the excerpts you just read from me. Here you have a man who is missing something, and so of course he comes to Jesus, in his sort of existential crisis and curiosity moment, and says, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And he's clearly been a very virtuous religious man, and Jesus says, "Keep all the commandments." And he says, "Well, I have, and I think he was very sincere in thinking, "Hey, I've been as faithful as I know how to be, as faithful as my parents have taught me," and so on. And then Jesus says, "Okay, I gotcha. One thing you lack," and he went for the one thing that had him around the neck. And for this particular man, it was his money. And so he said, "You let go of that, you stop plugging your umbilical cord into that and plug it into me instead to get your life. Come follow me. Just let all that go, give it to the poor, and come follow me." And the man, it was too much for him. And so he turns away. But there are a couple of statements in that episode that are easily missed that I think make the whole story. And one is that when Jesus looked at him, he loved him. It doesn't say that Jesus looked at him and scolded him. It doesn't say that Jesus started a political movement against him. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say any of that. It says that Jesus looked at him and loved him. He saw a living soul and not an opponent. And then it said, as the man walked away, he walked away sad. And what the light bulb that goes on for me for that is, if there are points of disagreement, as a Christian, it is incumbent upon me to do everything I can relationally with that person or people group, so that if they end up not buying into Christianity, they will walk away feeling like, man, they've got some weird beliefs, but they sure love well. They sure believe in my dignity as a human being. As a gay man, as a Muslim, as an agnostic, as a fill in the blank. While their moral vision may be different than mine, while their understanding of healthy, flourishing humanity might be different than mine, boy, do they love well. And I feel like, as I read the rich ruler account, that's the experience. He's walking away thinking, man, I can't imagine letting go of all my money, but I know that somehow I'm missing out on something really great as I walk away.
Well, on that money theme, I think people who are picking up this book may actually think it's just about relationships, but along that line, you said this with regard to money. Why would Jesus tell the rich ruler to give everything to the poor but not demand the same from Abraham or Job? It was because the rich ruler didn't really have money. Money had him. Mm-hmm. The man he thought he couldn't live without his money, in truth, wouldn't be able to live with it. You're a pastor of a fairly, I'm going to guess, knowing where you are, I haven't been to the church, but certainly know the area. It's a pretty opulent neighborhood. Mm-hmm. How does your congregation take some of these messages?
Beautifully. So just 2 weeks ago, case in point, I delivered to our congregation. I said, I've got some good news and some bad news for you. This is Vision Sunday, and on Vision Sunday, you always talk about the economic situation of the church and what your opportunities are and so on. And I said, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is we are ahead of the curve on the national average, and really the global average that says that 80% of the freight of a church is carried by 20% of the people in terms of volunteer hours, in certain terms of resources given, and so on. The good news is we are ahead of the curve. The bad news is we're way behind the biblical ideal, and our percentage are better than but what I proceeded to say is there are 12-year-old girls and 16-year-old boys that give 10 and 15% of their babysitting and Chick-fil-A money. The reality is there are millionaires who are riding on their tithes as you benefit from the ministry here and give nothing. You have 12-year-old girls and 16-year-old boys paying for the ministry that you're enjoying, that you give nothing to, so that you can have an extra boat, an extra vacation home, etc. I don't preach like that every week, but I have to every 2 or 3 years. And the response was beautiful. People coming up to me in tears, just saying, "Wow, that really put things in perspective for me," and how wonderful that we have children who are living more faithfully than their grandparents in some cases, and what a prophetic call from our kids to live as becomes a follower of Christ and recognize that all of our lives belong to Him. And the hardest section of the Sermon on the Mount, when we preached the Sermon on the Mount last year, the hardest section is the last 4 sections. They're all about judgment. And I was like, oh, Lord, I didn't anticipate this. I didn't even think about the fact that we'd go out with these really hard driving messages.
By the way,
about
let me cold cock you one more time.
What's that?
Let me cold cock you one more time.
I know. And it's like left hook right in the nose, on the cheek, and just the receptivity was beautiful. And I think the reason is the Holy Spirit is working in people's lives, but also we even the hard stuff, you have to not only preach it, but embody it in a community that will put its arm around you in the middle of conviction. We repudiate sort of the whole idea of a shame culture in a church, and conviction can come without shaming.
Sure
It has to come without shaming, or it's not really of the Lord. The only people that Jesus seemed to come close to scolding were the scolders.
Sure.
And so, you've got to combine conviction with compassion and gentleness. But,
you also take on, we're dealing with racial tensions in our culture. I'm pleased to say, and I think you voiced it as well at the gatherings, also taking on some of this with some of the folks that are actually communicating to the wider body. You said a first step toward true diversity, whether cultural, economic, political, ethnic, or otherwise, is to recognize that charity toward minorities by itself is not enough. Charity has to be truly charitable and biblical, must also result in empowerment, where the majority humbles and positions itself to follow the minority voice regularly.
Mm-hmm.
How do you do that in Nashville?
So I can only speak to our own context. We are, we're on the third leg of a 15-leg journey in that respect. We've taken steps. One is that the second most frequent communicator in our church from the pulpit is a Korean, who his name is Paul Lim. He's a brilliant Vanderbilt professor who was at Gordon Conwell Seminary before, so that's part of it. Is to the microphone needs to be yielded to the minority voice, and minority it's ethnic, but it's also economic. It's also generational. Sure. There are all kinds of minority statuses in a church. And so we've put a person of color in that leadership position and in other leadership roles where they're the minority in the room, and yet they're the majority voice. In terms of shaping the culture of the area of ministry and the lane of ministry that they're responsible for. We've built, I think, very life-giving relationships with pastors and church leaders around Nashville of color, mainly African Americans in our experience. And I'm preaching in an African American revival next week. First revivals I've ever preached, have been in my Nashville experience, and we have, people of color come as guest speakers, and it's very intentional and by design to sort of awaken our people to the reality that as Nashville does this, Nashville's got this reputation as the third coast, this forward-moving, progressive city, but because of this, there's also a narrative of decline in certain minority communities as they get gentrified out, and it's harder for them to find work than it used to be, and so on. And so we try to really keep it in front of our people, that Micah was talking about this morning, that it is the call of the gospel to pay very, very close attention to the fact that not everybody starts in the same place. Mm-hmm. Not everybody can pull themselves up by the bootstraps, especially if they've never been given a pair of boots. Mm-hmm. And it's been beautiful to see. We've lost some people over that. Who just it's too uncomfortable or whatever. But I think we've gained a lot of hearts, and there's been this wonderful shift. Like people who grew up with help in their homes are now seeing sort of the racial reconciliation and justice missional communities that we have formed be their thing and be their area of ministry. And there's been like 82-year-olds, repenting of living in breathing air that they didn't even realize they've been breathing all their lives. And so it's incremental, it's slow. How successful or unsuccessful it is, you really have to ask a person of color in our community. I'm not really the one qualified to say it's successful. It really, the minority experience, according to the minority, whoever the minority is really going to be your governing principle for how well things are going.
You said the third of 15 step or 15, stage process. What would 14, 15 look like?
Christ will have returned, and the new heaven and new earth will have been inaugurated, and all nations, tribes, and tongues and people groups will be around the throne together, equally sharing the riches and fullness of what Christ has come to bring. What my minority pastor friends have taught me, especially in the Black community, is there is a certain poverty that the people that I pastor carry, and that is there's an inhibition about intimacy with Christ, and about almost a handicap of really being able to storm the gates of heaven, in prayer and really feeling your faith. In minority communities, particularly in disadvantaged and oppressed situations, there's such a hunger and such a thirst that, if you just sit there and listen to, for instance, Pastor Ronnie Mitchell, who's my Black pastor friend that I talked about this morning, just sit there and listen to him pray for 5 minutes. You'll feel like you were just right on the edge of glory, because when you're sitting next to somebody that's really close to Jesus, you know that you're really close to Jesus too in that moment. But it's really striking that with affluence comes what New York Times has called at times an affluenza, sort of a malaise around things that will ultimately be the only things that matter in the end. And so I wonder if in the end, because the kingdom of God is so upside down, we're all going to look back and think, wait, these weren't the rich people and these weren't the poor people after all. It was actually in the reverse the whole time. Jesus looks at Pharisees who've grown up in religion all their lives and says, the prostitutes are entering the kingdom before you are. The prostitutes and the crooks are entering the kingdom before you are. And you got your whole Bible memorized. And all they know is John 3:16, and yet you need to learn from them. And you go to Luke 7, and you've got this prostitute giving a clinic to the Pharisees on what real worship looks like. Just getting down, washing Jesus' feet with her hair and her lips, the tools of her trade. And they're all repulsed, and Jesus is saying, this is what worship looks like. Welcome to the seminar.
Listening to you speak, is there any topic that's out of bounds for the Jesus follower?
I hope not.
Reading your book, I started, there's chapter on almost every major issue that we're dealing with in the culture, and it's all under the title Befriend. And I began to think, I don't think there's a subject, but I'm asking you plainly now, is there a subject for which we as Christ followers really should just avoid?
I think there are attitudes we should avoid in certain conversations, but no subjects. I love what Abraham Kuyper said, that God looks at every square inch of his universe and declares that it's mine. And if everything is his domain, and we are his vice regents, if we are his ambassadors, then every square inch is fair game. But the question is, will we go into every situation, including the ones that are... This is why I'm so impressed with Fred Smith and inviting Micah to come in and say things that maybe have never been heard by some of us, that are in the community here this week. What a courageous thing of Fred. What a courageous thing of Micah to stand up, and I hope your listeners get some exposure to that. But you have to go there. Those sorts of uncomfortable moments actually inform and educate humble hearts for how to enter a situation full of grace and truth. Oftentimes we'll do one or the other, but to go in full of grace, we become codependent enablers in the situation. To go in full of truth, but with no grace, we're bullies, and Jesus is neither one of those. And so, just being able to read the situation, high levels of emotional intelligence and really spiritual intelligence, being able to read the situation and what kind of heart is in front of me right now, and what is that heart likely to need? Conviction or compassion, counsel or comfort, grace, truth. Where does the weight go? Because all of the above needs to come into the equation, but depending on who's in front of us, if you got a smug Pharisee, get fierce. If you've got a broken prostitute, go with gentleness. Don't scold. And so
I close out with this one piece before I want to ask you about this new book that's coming out. You said, compelled by the love of Christ, we must not withhold kindness or friendship from any person or people group, and we must not engage in any sort of us against them posturing. This is in itself is countercultural to modern society. Compelled by the truth of Christ, we must honor and obey the Creator's design, even when his design is countercultural and at times counterintuitive to us. His ways and his thoughts are higher than ours.
Mm-hmm.
You really live by that?
Not perfectly. It's aspirational, and sometimes real, But I think all of us, we've got to shed it takes a lifetime to shed whatever prejudices we carry with us. In the same way, C.S. Lewis's Eustace had to, shed that dragon skin, and let Aslan claw at him, incrementally to get the dragon skin off of him. But I hope that I'm more that person next year than I am now, and more that person in 5 years than I am next year.
You've written a new book. Tell us about that. What can we expect, and when does it come out, and how quickly can we get our hands on it?
From Weakness to Strength, 8 vulnerabilities that can make or break you as a leader. This book was written for anyone in leadership who's a Christian. It really is from a Christian perspective, and it's a cultivation of gospel in the heart for the Christian leader. Hopefully it could be of some use for somebody who's not a Christian, but the primary target was Christians. It was primarily born out of 2 things. One, the inspiration that I shared, that I got from Tim, just seeing his private life matched up with his public life. He was just as alive to Jesus on his sofa at home in his gym shorts as he is in the pulpit. That inspirational aspect. And then there's another thing that terrifies me, and that's that 5 of my friends have lost their ministries in the last 18 months because of moral failure. And the moral failure was symptomatic of isolation and misplaced ambition. Ambition is a great thing when it's placed in the right place, but misplaced ambition, inability to deal in a healthy way with criticism and those sorts of things. And so the book is really an encouragement to take these Achilles heels and these thorns in the flesh that all leaders face at some point, and process them through the grid of gospel health. It's really a goal. The goal of the book is to help me be healthy. I really wrote it for myself, to just be a healthy person, to finish well, to build on the eulogy virtues that David Brooks talks and writes about, and let the resume virtues take care of themselves in their own way as God determines. But it's really I guess the summary is a prayer that I pray every day, sort of the summary of the whole book. So you don't even need to buy the book. This is the whole summary. Lord, grant me character that is greater than my gifts and abilities, and grant me humility that is greater than my platform and influence. I think if we can get that right, then we'll find health on the other end of it.
How can our viewers, listeners, keep up with what you're doing? Do you have a website?
So scottsauls.com. My blog's there. A link to our church is there. A link to my sermons are there. The books I've written, there's a page on there. It's pretty simple. I write there every week. I'll post an essay on something there. So that might be the best sort of first stop.
Well, Scott, thanks for joining us at the gathering. We've so enjoyed you.
Yeah, having a blast here. It's fun.
Great.